Good morning. And anyway, if you're unacquainted with what Thrillville is, let me go through a quick little description and history. This game was made by LucasArts, and the amount of weird games made by this company really fascinates me. The game list isn't necessarily weird in the traditional sense, but it's weird because this is George Lucas's game company, and I, for a while, only thought that they made things like Star Wars The Clone Wars for the DS, so mostly garbage licensed games, so things such as Star Wars, Indiana Jones, and however, before they were eventually bought out and closed by Disney, they made a wide array of games, in this case, Thrillville. If I were to explain this in a very simple way, and I know this is going to sound very weird, I would explain it as a mix of Roller Coaster Tycoon and Animal Crossing. Now, for those of you that didn't immediately leave the video because of that comparison, let me explain. It obviously reminds me of Roller Coaster Tycoon because... but the comparison to Animal Crossing is what is a bit more, questionable. So for one, you walk around the park and talk to your visitors, unlike Roller Coaster Tycoon where you're pretty much God, much like The Sims. Man, I am on fire with these weird comparisons today. Another thing is you get to have first-hand experience with at any time you'd like. And that's all I've got. But there's probably more someone else could come up with. Also, this is a complete side note, but apparently there was a theme park called Thrillville, USA that used to be next to a theme park I've actually been to called Enchanted Forest, but both of those are completely separate topics on their own. I just wonder, was the name of this game potentially influenced by this small theme park? Just something to think about, I guess. Anyway, the story is that you, a human being, spanning in age from a literal 8-year-old to someone who's maybe 16, is given a theme park by someone who is called an insane person throughout the span of the game. Anyway, the actual game is very fun and has 5 main worlds, actually called parks. These parks are, and I'm about to say Thrillville an uncomfortable amount of times, Thrillville, Thrillville Time Warp, Thrillville Paradise, Thrillville Adventures, and Treasures of Thrillville. Each of these parks have separate sections related to the overall theme of the park. They're each very similar, but they have a nice difficulty curve. So it took me 5 hours to beat this game instead of 3. The first park is mostly a tutorial, but the second is much more difficult, being very dirty and in disrepair on arrival. The third park is not in this much chaos when you get there, but instead you are given not nearly as much money and the stuff is much more expensive. Plus, the missions are more difficult, making everything even harder. The fourth world is just the third, but even more difficult, to the point I only recorded about a quarter of the gameplay, and the footage was still about 20 minutes long. The final park is a bit more special, however, because it's basically the end game. You only have 8 very difficult missions, and barely anything to unlock. It's kinda sad when you get to this point, because everything is just very dull and empty. It's the first park where you're truly on your own with what you want to do with the park. Anyway, I talked about missions while talking about each of the parks, but I didn't actually go into depth about what those are. There's 5 different kinds, these being build, where you basically just build a specific kind of ride, coaster, or stalls or a certain type or specification. Game, where you have to beat a guest at a game in an intense battle of facts and logic. So you basically just jump on a trampoline. Guest missions, which can range from talk to the guest about food cause he like food, to make out with a random guest. Did I mention this game likes pandering to teenagers? Upkeep, which is basically where you just use your staff or of a mechanic, janitor, and a cheerleader to complete certain tasks. And finally, business, where you basically just manage money, guests, and happiness throughout the park. These tasks are much more fun than they sound, building in difficulty and getting more specific as you proceed. This is also another thing that it has in common with Animal Crossing. It's much more fun than it sounds. where both games just kind of sound like chores. Anyway, the game's achievements are special because they pay attention to something that makes this game especially special: the minigames. Some notable ones are Sparkle Island, which is a fun arcade platformer shooter game that is actually quite unique in art style, and now that I think of it, the gameplay is pretty much Bubble Bobble. All of the fun first-person shooter minigames, which somehow figure out how to control better than GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64. Saucer Sumo is a very addicting game where your goal is to knock your opponents off the arena with very slippery hovering controls, which would usually be a bad thing, but in this case it makes it more fun and chaotic, much like a party game. Saucer Soccer is one of my least favorite games, but it is very special. It's pretty much Rocket League with worse controls. This game was released in 2006. I know that soccer with vehicles isn't necessarily an idea you can point to Rocket League for creating, but it definitely popularized it. And it's crazy that this theme park tycoon for the PS2 made a game like this long before Rocket League was ever conceived. Another great game is Luftwaffe 109 and Event Horizon, which I don't have footage of either of these because they aren't required for the story, are both very fun arcade-style shooters, Luftwaffe, or however you pronounce it, being vertical, and Event Horizon being horizontal. There's also the trampoline minigame, which I remember being much more fun than it actually is. Trojan Quest is a very fun medieval fantasy-style twin-stick shooter with different classes depending on what you want for the game, and which many of the games have. So that's about it for games, but let's talk about my favorite topic in any review: the music. So this game has a special property of having all of the music being from indie singers and bands from the mid-2000s. Did I mention this game likes to pander to teenagers? The music is good when you're very tired, listening to it when you're sitting on the couch walking around your park in-game, and with the compression. In no other case though, all three of those specifications need to be met. The dialogue between characters, however, is one of the only things that isn't pandering to teens unless you're doing one of those weird dating minigames, and all of it is top-tier comedy. So when you talk to a guest, you have a choice whether to talk about the park or to say the most random facts ever. The random facts can be funny in and of themselves sometimes, but it's even funnier when you get the guest reactions. They can range from saying, "That's cool," very blankly, to literally making fun of you for telling them about George Washington. Also, all of the characters have a bladder meter on them, so you can quite literally go up to every single person in the park and check how much they need to pee. How does this game have more attention to detail when it comes to interacting with other characters than Animal Crossing New Horizons? Oh, and I forgot to talk about the entire roller coaster creation tycoon in this game. It's not very in-depth, but it's honestly very good for two reasons. One, it's automatically more impressive than Roller Coaster Tycoon's offerings, solely based off of the fact it's in 3D, and it's slightly less nauseating when you ride them, a feature only available in some of the Tycoon games. And two, it has a bunch of different ride types, ranging from boring skyline ride that could be found at an actual park to a flying coaster, the first of the type shown in the game, only opening 3 years before the game released. And no one is going to tell me that they started and ended production in the same year. It is so cool that they include so many different types of coasters into this game, just giving it a much more detailed feel than the game really has. This game honestly hits it out of the park when it comes to a lot of the elements, but others just leave me with a bad taste in my mouth. Its signature pandering to a teen demographic is kind of annoying at times, especially considering some of the aspects with this game are very unique and give it its own personality. This game is a solid 49 out of 54 and is one of my favorite games from my childhood. Thank you, Thrillville, for making me find out about my love for roller coasters, and especially giving me the ability to milk it for content for my 40-something subscribers.